In the unforgiving dust of the Arizona Territory, a woman's reputation is all she has. But for Eleanor Vance, a school teacher from Boston, trapped in a gilded cage, her reputation was the price of survival. She was promised a new life, but found herself the property of a tyrant, with the date of her forced wedding looming like a hangman's noose. Her only escape, her only hope, was a man locked in the sheriff's iron cage. A man the townsfolk called a savage, a murderer, a silent Apache warrior everyone feared. This is the story of how she walked into that jail, looked into the eyes of death itself, and made the most desperate plea of her life. The dust of Redemption Bluff settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the soul. It clung to the hem of Eleanor Vance's worn traveling dress, worked its way into the lines on her hands, and seemed to settle permanently in the back of her throat. It was the taste of deceit. She had come west, chasing a promise, a series of elegantly penned letters from a Mr. Bartholomew Blackwood, a widower, and the town's founder, who sought an educated companion and wife to bring a touch of Eastern civility to his rugged domain. He had written of building a schoolhouse, of a life of purpose under the vast cerulean sky. Instead, she had been met at the stagecoach, not by the venerable silver-haired gentleman from the photograph, but by his son Corbin. Bartholomew, it turned out, had succumbed to a fever a month prior, and Corbin, who inherited his father's land, his wealth, and his suffocating control over the town, had also inherited her. The contract is with the Blackwood name, Miss Vance. Corbin had said his smile, a predatory slash beneath his perfectly groomed moustache. His eyes, the color of cold slate, had roamed over her with an unnerving sense of ownership. The arrangements stand. You will be my wife. Now, 2 weeks later, Eleanor was a prisoner in the Blackwood residence, a sprawling 2-story timber house that loomed over the smaller, sadder buildings of Redemption Bluff like a hawk over a field of mice. It was a house of suffocating silence, filled with heavy, dark furniture and the lingering ghost of a promise. Her days were a carefully orchestrated routine of polite conversation, stilted dinners, and Corbin's constant chilling proximity. He never raised his voice, never laid a hand on her improperly, yet his presence was a cage, as real as any made of iron. He watched her, corrected her, and spoke of their future as if her consent was a mere formality he had already purchased. The wedding was set for the end of the month. The date was a death sentence. Eleanor had seen the way Corbin treated his stable hands, the fear in the eyes of the shopkeepers when he entered their establishments. She had heard the whispered story of a prospector, a man named Silas Croft, who had vanished after a loud disagreement with Corbin over a land claim. The town was a web, and Corbin was the spider at its center. Sheriff Brody, a man with a perpetually sweating brow and a spine made of jelly, was just another fly caught in the silk. Desperation was a physical thing, a tightening in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She had tried reasoning with Corbin, appealing to his sense of decency, only to be met with amused condescension. She had considered fleeing, but the town was an island in a sea of desert, and Corbin's men watched the stagecoach and the livery. Her only moments of solitude were the daily walks Corbin permitted her to take, never beyond the edge of town, and always under the watchful eye of one of his men from a distance. It was during one of these dreary processions that she first heard the whispers about the man in the jail. 2 women, their faces hidden by sunbonnets, were gossiping near the mercantile. Their voices dropped to hushed, fearful tones. They say he hasn't spoken a word since Brody brought him in. Killed Silas Croft in cold blood, they say. Found him standing over the body, not a flicker of remorse on his face. He's not a man, he's a devil. An Apache shadow. Just looking at him will freeze your blood. The prisoner. He had been there since shortly after her own arrival. She had seen Sheriff Brody lead him in chains from the desert, a tall, silent figure whose presence seemed to suck the very air from the dusty street. The townsfolk had scattered, pulling their children inside their faces, a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity. He was accused of the murder of Silas Croft, the very man who had argued with Corbin. The convenience of it all was a bitter pill. Eleanor's mind, the sharp, analytical mind of a teacher, began to piece things together. A murdered prospector, a convenient suspect, a town ruled by a tyrant. The prisoner was Corbin's scapegoat. He was a pawn just as she was, but he was a pawn the entire town feared. A sliver of an idea so wild and reckless it made her feel faint began to form. It was insane. It was unthinkable. It was the only thing she had left. That evening, at another tense dinner, Corbin presented her with a strand of pearls. They were heavy and cold against her skin. "A pre-wedding gift, my dear," he said, his fingers brushing her neck, sending a wave of revulsion through her. "You will make a beautiful Blackwood bride." His touch solidified her resolve. She would not be a Blackwood bride. She would rather be the bride of the devil himself. The next morning, feigning a headache to avoid Corbin's company, she slipped out of the grand house. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a drum of rebellion. She ignored the curious stares, the whispers that followed her down the main street. Her destination was the squat, sun-bleached building with the barred windows, the sheriff's office, the jail. She pushed open the door, the small bell above it, jangling with what sounded to her like a death knell. Sheriff Brody looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening in surprise. "Miss Vance, is something wrong? Does Mr. Blackwood require something?" No, Sheriff, Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. She clutched her reticule, the knuckles of her gloved hands, white. "I am here on my own account. I wish to see the prisoner." Sheriff Brody's jaw went slack, his pen clattering onto the scarred wooden surface of his desk. He blinked a slow bovine motion, as if he couldn't possibly have heard her correctly. The prisoner," he stammered, mopping his forehead with an already damp handkerchief. "Miss Vance, with all due respect, that's not a place for a lady. He's a dangerous man. A savage." "I am aware of the charges against him," Eleanor replied, her voice firm, betraying none of the tremor she felt in her soul. She had rehearsed this, planned for this feeble resistance. "Nevertheless, I have a right as a citizen of this town to speak with him. Do I not? I wish to ask him some questions pertaining to my own peace of mind." It was a weak justification, but it was all she had. The sheriff sputtered, looking from Eleanor to the heavy wooden door that led to the cells, as if expecting Corbin Blackwood himself to materialize and strike him down for even entertaining the notion. The power Corbin held over this man was absolute. But Eleanor's presence, her status as the town founder's chosen bride-to-be, gave her a sliver of authority he couldn't easily dismiss. He was trapped between his fear of Corbin and the conventions of dealing with a lady of her apparent station. I suppose, he conceded reluctantly, but I'll have to be present. I can't leave you alone with him. It wouldn't be safe." "That is acceptable," Eleanor said, relief and terror warring within her. Heaving a sigh of profound reluctance, Sheriff Brody retrieved a large iron key from a hook on the wall and led her through the door. The air instantly grew hotter, thicker, and smelled of stale sweat dust and something else, something wild and elemental. There were 2 cells. One was empty. In the other he stood. He wasn't what she had expected. The whispers had painted a picture of a slavering beast, a monster. The man in the cell was tall and lean, his body a collection of taut lines and coiled strength, visible even through his tattered shirt and buckskin trousers. His back was to them as they entered, and he stood perfectly still, gazing out the small barred window at a sliver of blindingly blue sky. His hair, a fall of polished jet, was long and unbound, reaching the middle of his back. He didn't flinch at the sound of the door, didn't acknowledge their presence in any way. Kane, the sheriff, said, his voice attempting a gruff authority that came out as a nervous squeak. "You have a visitor." The man Kane turned slowly, and Eleanor forgot how to breathe. His face was a masterpiece of harsh angles and severe beauty, his cheekbones high and sharp, his jaw firm. His skin was the color of rich, sun-baked earth. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, so dark they seemed to absorb the light, and they were filled with a piercing, unnerving intelligence. There was no savagery in them, no madness. There was only a profound stillness, a contemptuous calm that was more intimidating than any outward show of aggression. He looked at her, and she felt utterly transparent, as if he could see the frantic, desperate machinations of her heart. "Miss Vance, this is Kane Brodie," said unnecessarily. Kane's gaze flickered to the sheriff for a bare second, a look of such withering disdain that Brodie actually took a step back. Then his eyes returned to Eleanor. He said nothing. The silence stretched thick and heavy. "Leave us," Eleanor said, her voice a whisper. "Miss Vance, I can't." "Stand by the door, Sheriff," she commanded, finding a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed. "If I scream, you may come in. Until then, you will grant me the privacy I have requested. Or would you prefer I discuss your reluctance with Mr. Blackwood?" The threat worked. Brodie's face paled. He retreated to the doorway, leaving it slightly ajar, his large frame blocking most of the light from the office. Eleanor stepped closer to the bars, her hands gripping the cold iron. They were separated by less than 2 feet. She could smell the scent of the desert on him, of sage and dry earth. His stillness was unnerving. He watched her, waiting. "They call you Kane," she began, her voice trembling slightly. He remained silent. His eyes never left hers. "They say you murdered Silas Croft." A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign that he'd heard her. "I don't believe them." She pressed on the words, tumbling out now. "I know what Corbin Blackwood is. I know he is capable of anything to protect what he believes is his. That prospector found something on Blackwood's land, didn't he, gold perhaps? And Corbin silenced him. And you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You saw it. That is why you are in here." Still, he said nothing. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. Doubt began to creep in. Was she wrong? Was he just a killer, after all? "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "Corbin Blackwood means to marry me. He holds a contract my intended signed before he died. In 13 days, I am to become his wife, his property. I will not do it. I would rather die." She paused, taking a ragged breath, her gaze pleading with his. "I have no money, no allies, no way to escape this town. You are my only hope." Finally he spoke. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was clear, unaccented English, which surprised her more than anything. "What do you want from a man in a cage?" he asked. The question hung in the hot, still air. This was it. The moment of her utter madness. "I want you to save me," she whispered, tears she had refused to shed for weeks, now burning at the back of her eyes. "And I will save you." A flicker of something, curiosity, amusement passed through his dark eyes. How Eleanor straightened up, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "There is an old territorial law. I found it in a book in Bartholomew's study. A condemned man, or a man awaiting trial for a capital crime, cannot be denied a final request if it is deemed reasonable. The law specifically mentions the right to marry. It was meant to legitimize children, but the language is clear. It is a right. She took a deep breath. Sheriff Brody is a weak man, but he is a man who fears the letter of the law almost as much as he fears Corbin. If you request it, he will have to perform the ceremony. She watched his face, searching for any reaction. He remained impassive. "Marry me, Kane." She begged, the words tasting of shame and desperation on her tongue. "Please, marry me. As your wife, I would no longer be Eleanor Vance, the woman contracted to the Blackwood name. I would be your wife. Corbin could not touch me. His claim would be nullified. The silence that followed was the most profound she had ever known. The buzzing of a fly near the window sounded like a roar. Kane's eyes searched her face, not with passion or pity, but with a cold, calculating intensity. He was weighing her, measuring her worth, her resolve, her use to him. "You would trade one cage for another," he said, his voice flat. "Why, because your cage has bars, I can see." She answered, the truth of it raw and sharp. "Corbin's is invisible, and it is everywhere. With you, I would be the wife of a man the whole town fears. They would leave me alone, and my freedom would be in securing yours." He stepped closer to the bars, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His gaze was so intense she felt it like a physical touch. "You want a shield," he stated. "Yes." "And what do I get? A wife who will weep in the corner while I hang no," she said, her chin lifting in defiance. "You get an ally. I am not a fool. I know Corbin framed you. You need proof. You need someone on the outside, someone who can get close to him, to his things, to his house. As the woman he thought he would marry, I have been in that house. I know its layout. I know his routines. I will be your eyes and ears. I will find the proof that you need to walk free. I swear it." He was quiet for a long time, his dark eyes boring into hers. He was looking for the lie, the weakness, the angle. Eleanor held his gaze, pouring every ounce of her sincerity, her desperation, her resolve into that silent contest. She was offering him a bargain, a devil's bargain, made in the dusty shadows of a jail cell. Her name, her body, her life, in exchange for his protection. His truth in exchange for her freedom. Finally, a slow, cold smile touched the corners of his lips. It was not a smile of warmth or humor, but of grim, dangerous understanding. Sheriff Kane called out, his voice resonating through the small building. He did not take his eyes off Eleanor. Brody scurried back into the room, his hand nervously hovering over the pistol at his hip. "What is it? What's going on?" "This woman," Kane said, his voice like stones grinding together, "has made a proposal. I accept." He looked back at Eleanor, the cold fire in his eyes sealing their pact. "Tell him the law," he commanded. "We will be married. Today." The air in the sheriff's office crackled with a tension so thick it felt like a physical weight. Sheriff Brody's face had cycled through a palette of colors from ghostly white to a blotchy, apoplectic red. He stared at Kane, then at Eleanor, then back again, his mouth opening and closing like a fish stranded on a riverbank. "Married, you? You can't be serious. This is preposterous," he blustered, sweat beading on his upper lip. "Mr. Blackwood will have my hide." The law sheriff, Eleanor, stated, her voice surprisingly calm. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play unfold. Territorial Statute 113, Section 4. Rights of the Accused in Matters of Capital Offence. I have read it. It grants the prisoner the right to settle personal affairs, including the sanctification of marriage prior to trial. It is non-negotiable. She had spent 2 sleepless nights poring over the dusty legal tomes in Bartholomew Blackwood's library, her candle burning low, searching for any loophole, any crack in the fortress of Corbyn's power. That statute had been her single, desperate discovery. But a license. A preacher, Brodie stammered, grasping at straws. The law also states that in the absence of a clergyman, a civic official such as a sheriff is empowered to perform the rite. Kane's deep voice cut through the sheriff's panicked protests. He had not moved from his position at the bars, but his presence dominated the room. He had been listening to the town's laws and whispers for weeks from his cell, and a verbal declaration before a witness constitutes a binding contract. You, Sheriff, are the official. And you are the witness. Brodie looked as though he was about to faint. He was caught between the clear, undeniable letter of the law and the unwritten, but far more terrifying law of Corbyn Blackwood. To deny the request was to break a territorial statute, a crime that could cost him his badge. To grant it was to incur the wrath of a man who owned his entire world. Eleanor pressed her advantage. Sheriff, my union with Mr. Blackwood is a private contract, an arrangement. It has not been sanctified. It is not a legal marriage. This, however, would be. You must know what will happen to me if you refuse, and if word were to reach the territorial marshal that you denied a prisoner his legal rights. The unspoken threat hung in the air. The marshal was a distant, almost mythical figure, but his authority was absolute. Sheriff Brodie's face crumpled in defeat. The fear of a known present danger was warring with the fear of a greater, more official one. All right, he breathed the word, a puff of pure misery. All right, get on with it. He retrieved a dusty leather-bound Bible from a drawer, handling it as if it were a venomous snake. He trudged back to the cell door, his shoulders slumped. There'll be no ceremony to speak of, he grumbled. Just say the words. And so the strangest of weddings took place. The bride stood on one side of the iron bars, her hands clenched at her sides, her travelling dress coated in a fine layer of red dust. The groom stood on the other, his gaze steady and unreadable, a silent predator observing his new peculiar reality. The only official was their shared jailer, a man sweating with fear and resentment. Do you, Kane, take this woman, Eleanor Vance, to be your lawfully wedded wife, Brodie mumbled, stumbling over the words. Kane's dark eyes were locked on Eleanor's. He was not looking at a bride, but at a co-conspirator, a chess piece he had just acquired. I do, he said, the 2 words a vow of iron, a seal on their desperate bargain. And do you, Eleanor Vance, take this man Kane to be your lawfully wedded husband? Eleanor's heart hammered. This was the final irrevocable step. She was binding herself to a stranger, a man accused of murder, a man the world called a savage. But in his eyes, she saw not savagery, but a sharp, calculating intelligence that was in its own terrifying way a comfort. He was a weapon, and she was directing him at Corbyn Blackwood. I do, she said, her voice clear and strong. Then by the power vested in me by the Arizona Territory, I pronounce you man and wife, Brodie finished in a rush, slamming the Bible shut, as if to ward off the evil he had just unleashed. There. It's done. Now, Mrs. Whatever your name is, I suggest you leave. Just as he spoke, the bell over the office door jangled violently. The door was thrown open, and Corbyn Blackwood stormed in his face, a mask of thunderous rage. 2 of his hired men, burly and grim-faced, flanked him. Brodie, what is the meaning of this? Corbyn roared, his eyes finding Eleanor by the cell. A look of pure possessive fury contorted his features. "Eleanor, get away from that animal." "What are you doing here?" Sheriff Brodie shrank back, turning a pale shade of green. "Mr. Blackwood, She insisted. "There's a law. I am his wife." Corbin, Eleanor said the words, feeling alien on her tongue. She stepped away from the bars, turning to face him, positioning herself subtly, so that both Corbin and Kane were in her line of sight. Corbin stopped dead. He stared at her, then at the defeated slump of the sheriff, then at the silent, watchful figure in the cell. A slow, incredulous laugh escaped his lips, a sound devoid of all humor. "His wife?" he sneered. "You've gone mad. This is a pathetic joke." "Our contract is nullified," Eleanor finished for him. "It was an agreement for me to marry into the Blackwood family. I have just married. The terms of the contract can no longer be met." Corbin's face darkened, the veins in his neck standing out. He took a menacing step toward her. "You think this little charade will protect you? You think marrying this filth changes anything? You are mine. You will come back to the house now." He reached for her arm, but Kane's voice, low and dangerous, stopped him cold. "Touch my wife, and I will show you how I earned my name." The threat was not loud, but it filled the small room with a chilling promise of violence. Corbin froze his hand, hovering in the air. He looked at Kane, who was now gripping the bars of his cell, his knuckles white. The placid calm was gone, replaced by a deadly intensity. For the first time, Eleanor saw the predator that the townsfolk whispered about. And for the first time, she saw fear in Corbin Blackwood's eyes. He was a bully and a tyrant, accustomed to cowering men and frightened women. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a man in a cage who looked at him as if the bars were a minor inconvenience. Corbin slowly lowered his hand, his rage warring with a primal instinct for self-preservation. He masked his fear with a sneer. "Enjoy your new accommodations, Mrs. Kane." He spat the name an insult. "Your husband will hang before the month is out, and when he does, I will be waiting. The contract may be void, but this town is still mine." He turned on his heel and stormed out, his men following in his wake. The silence he left behind was heavy with unspoken threats. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding her legs, suddenly feeling weak. She leaned against the wall for support. She had done it. She had escaped Corbin's grasp, but she had thrown herself into an even more uncertain future. She looked at Kane. His expression was once again impassive, the momentary flash of menace gone. "You have your shield," he said, his voice flat. "Now I expect you to uphold your end of the bargain. My freedom. Your first task is to find a place to live. You cannot stay in his house." He was right. "There's a small room in the back of this office," Brodie offered, meekly eager to placate his new and terrifying problem. "Supposed to be for a deputy, but I ain't never had one. Got a cot. It's not much, but you can stay there. Close by." Eleanor nodded. It was perfect. A room attached to her husband's prison. She would be the jailer's wife, the pariah of Redemption Bluff. She looked from the defeated sheriff to the man in the cell who was now her husband. Their alliance was sealed. The war had just begun. Life as Mrs. Kane was a study in isolation. Redemption Bluff, which had treated her with a cautious deference, as Corbin Blackwood's intended, now shunned her with a silent, uniform hostility. When she walked to the mercantile to spend the last of her own money on meager supplies, women would pull their children close and cross the street. Men would stop talking and stare, their expressions a mixture of contempt and fear. She was no longer just an outsider. She was a traitor to her own kind, the woman who had willingly bound herself to the town's caged monster. The small deputy's room at the back of the jail became her entire world. It contained a narrow cot, a small table, a single chair, and a wash basin. Its one window looked out onto a dusty alley. It was a cell of its own, but it was a fortress compared to the opulent prison of the Blackwood house. She spent her first few days in a state of suspended shock, cleaning the small space with a frantic energy, trying to impose order on the chaos her life had become. Her interactions with her husband were strange and Spartan. They were bound by a legal document and a desperate pact, but they were utter strangers. Each morning she would bring him the plate of bland food Sheriff Brodie provided. She would pass it through the small slot in the cell door. Sometimes they would speak, but their conversations were not those of a husband and wife. They were the conversations of a general and his spy. "Corbin keeps his ledgers in his father's study," Kane said one morning, his voice a low murmur that wouldn't carry to the front office. "On the bottom shelf behind a set of books on geology. Look for discrepancies. Look for payments to men who don't exist. He is stealing from his own mining operations." "How do you know that?" Eleanor asked, amazed. "I watched him from the hills for weeks before I was taken," he replied, his gaze distant. "I was tracking him. I studied his habits. He is a creature of routine and arrogance. He believes no one is smart enough to unravel his schemes. He was teaching her to see, to observe. He would ask her about the townsfolk, about the gossip she overheard, about the way Sheriff Brodie flinched whenever Corbin's name was mentioned. From the confines of his cell, he was mapping the entire social and political landscape of the town, using her as his censors. Eleanor in turn learned to read his silences. She saw the way his eyes tracked the movement of the sun across the floor, the way his muscles tensed when one of Corbin's men swaggered past the jail. She began to see not an animal, but a man of incredible discipline and patience. A predator, yes, but one who was content to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Corbin, for his part, did not let her go easily. He couldn't force her back, not legally, but he could make her life a living hell. He instructed the mercantile owner, Mr. Abernathy, to triple the price of goods for her. He saw to it that the water barrel nearest the jail was always mysteriously empty. These were petty cruelties designed to break her, to force her to come crawling back to him. One afternoon, as she was returning from a long walk to the well at the far end of town, lugging 2 heavy buckets of water, 2 of Corbin's men blocked her path. They were the same men who had flanked him in the jail. "Well, well, look what we have here," the taller one sneered, his teeth stained with tobacco. "The savage's wife. You look tired, Mom. Maybe you made a mistake. Mr. Blackwood is a forgiving man." "Get out of my way," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but her gaze firm. "We're just trying to be neighborly," the other one chuckled, stepping closer. He reached out as if to touch her hair. Eleanor flinched back, stumbling, and water sloshed over the side of the bucket, soaking the hem of her dress in mud. Before the man's hand could make contact, a new voice cut through the air, quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "That's far enough, boys." It was Reverend Michael, the town's young, earnest preacher. He was a timid man by nature, one who usually kept his eyes down, and his sermons focused on forgiveness rather than fire and brimstone. But now he stood between Eleanor and Corbin's men, his Bible clutched in his hand like a shield. "She is under my protection," the Reverend said, his voice gaining strength. "This is a house of God, and she is one of my flock. Go on now. Leave her be." The men looked at each other, then at the small church behind the Reverend. Attacking a preacher was a line even they were hesitant to cross. With a final contemptuous glare at Eleanor, they turned and ambled away. "Thank you, Reverend." Eleanor breathed, her heart still pounding. "It was nothing, my child," he said, his kind eyes filled with concern. "What Corbin is doing is a sin. This town, it has lost its way. If you ever need sanctuary, my door is always open." This small act of kindness was a beacon in her bleak existence. It was a crack in Corbin's wall of control. When she recounted the event to Cain later that evening, he listened intently, his expression unreadable. "The preacher," he said after a long silence. He was friends with Silas Croft. They would often play checkers at the Mercantile. It was another piece of the puzzle, a potential ally. Her opportunity to act came a few days later. A fierce dust storm blew in from the west, blanketing Redemption Bluff in a thick, choking cloud of red. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The townsfolk huddled indoors, the streets deserted. It was the perfect cover. "Go now," Cain urged her, his voice a low command from the shadows of his cell. "He will be at the saloon, drinking with his men, waiting for the storm to pass. This is your chance. The study. Find the ledger." Her blood ran cold, but she knew he was right. This was what their bargain was for. Pulling a heavy shawl over her head to shield her face from the stinging sand, Eleanor slipped out of the jail. The wind howled, tearing at her clothes and filling the air with a mournful shriek. The world was a maelstrom of red dust and sound. The Blackwood house was dark and silent, appearing like a ghost ship in the storm. She circled to the back, her heart in her throat. The kitchen door was as she had hoped, unlocked. She slipped inside her movements, silent as a phantom. The house was eerily quiet. She crept through the familiar rooms, her feet making no sound on the thick rugs. She reached the study. The room smelled of leather and Corbin's cloying cigar smoke. With trembling hands, she lit a small lamp, keeping the flame low. She went straight to the bookshelf Cain had described. The geology books were there. She pulled them out. Behind them, tucked away in the shadows, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Her hands shook as she opened it. The pages were filled with Corbin's neat, precise script. Columns of figures, dates, names. It took her several minutes to understand what she was seeing. There were payrolls for miners, but the names were repeated. There were supply orders from companies she had never heard of. And then she saw it. A separate page tucked into the back. It wasn't numbers. It was a crude map showing a small canyon north of town, an area marked with an X, and beside it, a series of notes. SC claim, rich vein, stubborn fool, final offer. SC Silas Croft. This was it. It wasn't a confession, but it was a motive. It was proof that Corbin knew about Croft's discovery and wanted it for himself. Suddenly she heard a sound from the front of the house, the main door opening and closing, heavy footsteps. Corbin was back. Panic seized her. She shoved the ledger back, replaced the books, and extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Her heart was a wild bird, beating against the cage of her ribs. There was no way out, except the way she had come. She could hear him moving in the main hall, cursing the storm. She flattened herself against the wall behind the heavy velvet curtains, praying the darkness would hide her. He entered the study, striking a match. The flare of light illuminated his face, twisted in a foul mood. He lit the main oil lamp on his desk, and the room was bathed in a warm, treacherous glow. He poured himself a whiskey, his back to her. He seemed agitated, pacing the room. Eleanor held her breath, certain he would hear the frantic thumping of her heart. Any moment now he would turn, he would see her, and it would all be over. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Eleanor remained frozen behind the curtain, her muscles screaming in protest. The thick velvet smelled of dust and time. Through a tiny gap, she could see Corbin pacing in front of his desk, the amber liquid in his glass catching the lamplight. He seemed consumed by a dark, restless energy, oblivious to her presence just a few feet away. Finally, after downing his whiskey in one gulp, he moved towards the bookshelf. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. He was going for the ledger. It was over. She braced herself, her mind racing, but there was nowhere to run. He reached out his hand, hovering over the geology section, then seemed to change his mind. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath, and instead grabbed a bottle of whiskey from a side table before stalking out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Eleanor waited, not daring to move for what felt like an hour. She listened to his heavy footsteps ascend the main staircase, then the sound of another door closing upstairs. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, a long, shuddering exhalation of pure relief. She had been so close to discovery, so close to a fate she couldn't bear to imagine. Slipping from behind the curtain, she fled the house as silently as she had entered, melting back into the swirling chaos of the dust storm. By the time she reached the relative safety of the jail, she was shaking uncontrollably, her clothes and hair caked with red grit. She recounted everything to Kane through the bars, her voice a low, urgent whisper. She told him about the ledger, the map, and the damning initials SC. He listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on her face. The storm howled outside, a fitting soundtrack to their clandestine meeting. "It is a motive," he said when she had finished. "But it is not proof of murder. A jury could be convinced it was a simple land dispute. We need more. We need the weapon. Or we need a witness." A witness? Eleanor's heart sank. The whole town is terrified of him. No one would dare speak out. The preacher Kane said, his voice certain. "Reverend Michael, you said he was Croft's friend. You said he stood up for you. He has a conscience. A conscience is a heavy burden. We must make it heavier." Their new plan was more dangerous than the last. Eleanor couldn't just steal a book. She had to move a man's soul. For the next week, she made a point of attending the Reverend's small, sparsely attended church services. She sat in the front pew, a solitary, ostracized figure, and listened to his sermons on truth, courage, and redemption. After each service, she would speak with him, thanking him for his words. She spoke of her own fears of the injustice she saw in the town, always circling the topic of Silas Croft, her gentle questions planting seeds of guilt. "Mr. Croft was a good man, wasn't he? Reverend," she'd ask. "He attended your services, I believe." "He was," Reverend Michael would say, his gaze troubled. "A fine man. Honest. A rare thing in these parts." His death was a tragedy. Eleanor would continue watching his face carefully. To have it blamed on an innocent man must weigh heavily on a town's soul. She could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a man caught between his faith and his fear. He knew the truth, she was sure of it, but speaking it would mean facing Corbin Blackwood. The breaking point came during a Sunday service. The Reverend's sermon was on the 9th commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness." His voice, usually so gentle, was filled with a pained, desperate fire. He wasn't just preaching to his small congregation. He was preaching to himself. His eyes kept finding Eleanor's, and she met his gaze without flinching, her expression a silent plea. After the service, as the last of the few attendees scurried away, Eleanor remained behind. The Reverend was putting away his Bible, his hands trembling slightly. "Reverend Michael," she began softly. "On the night Silas Croft was killed, did you see anything?" He froze his back to her. The silence in the small, sun-drenched church was absolute. I don't know what you mean, my child," he said, his voice strained. "I think you do," Eleanor pressed, stepping closer. "Mr. Croft was your friend. He trusted you. He came to you that evening, didn't he? He was afraid. He told you about the gold, and he told you that Corbin Blackwood had threatened him." The Reverend slowly turned to face her. His face was pale, his eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and torment. "How could you know that?" "Because it's the truth," Eleanor whispered. "And the truth is all that matters. An innocent man is going to hang for a crime. He did not commit a crime. You know he did not commit. His life is in your hands." A tear tracked its way down the preacher's cheek. "I am a coward," he choked out, his composure finally shattering. Silas did come to me. He was terrified. He showed me the assay report. It was a fortune. He said Corbyn had given him a final ultimatum sign over the claim for a pittance or disappear. I told him to be careful. I told him to pray. I offered him a place to stay the night, but he was too agitated. He wanted to get his things and leave town on the morning stage. He collapsed onto the front pew, burying his face in his hands. Later that night, I heard a gunshot from the direction of the canyon. I was afraid. I barricaded my door and I prayed. The next morning they brought in your husband, and they said he had done it. And I said nothing. I was afraid Corbyn would come for me next. What can I do, my word against his? He owns this town. Your word backed by evidence, Eleanor said, her heart pounding with a surge of adrenaline. We have the motive from his own ledger. We just need you. Your testimony will be the stone that starts the avalanche. She knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his shaking shoulder. Courage is not the absence of fear, Reverend. It is acting in spite of it. You preach of redemption. Here it is, the chance to redeem not just an innocent man, but this entire town. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with tears. But behind the fear, a tiny spark of resolve was igniting. He had spent his life speaking of righteous action. Now he was being called upon to act. The trial is in 2 days, Eleanor said. The circuit judge arrives tomorrow. Will you speak the truth? Reverend, before God and before the law. Reverend Michael took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked at the simple wooden cross hanging above the altar, then back at Eleanor. He nodded slowly, a single decisive movement. I will, he whispered. May God have mercy on my soul. Eleanor left the church feeling a surge of triumphant hope, but it was quickly tempered by a cold dread. They had a witness, but Corbyn Blackwood was not a man who would let himself be cornered without a fight. The next 48 hours would be the most dangerous of all their lives. She had to get word to Kane. They had to prepare. The unmasking was at hand, and it would likely be bathed in blood. The arrival of Circuit Judge Alistair Wright, a stern, hawk-nosed man, flanked by 2 implacable U.S. Marshals, signaled an authority that Corbyn Blackwood could not control. The air in Redemption Bluff crackled with anticipation. The trial was convened in the saloon, its tables cleared to make room for the townspeople who packed the space, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Kane was led from his cell, not with the defeated shuffle of a condemned man, but with a quiet, unnerving dignity. He was seated between the 2 marshals, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on Eleanor. She sat in the front row beside a pale but resolute Reverend Michael, offering her husband a subtle nod of support. Across the room, Corbyn Blackwood smirked, seated beside a hired lawyer from Tucson, radiating an unshakable confidence. To him, this was merely the final act of a play he had written and directed. The prosecution's case was as simple as it was damning. A nervous Sheriff Brody testified that he'd found Kane standing over Silas Croft's body in the canyon, holding a bloody knife. The knife itself was presented as evidence, and the prosecutor rested his case, confident of a swift conviction. When the judge asked for the defense, Kane rose to his feet, the chains on his wrists clinking softly. I will speak for myself, he announced, his deep voice silencing the room's murmurs. Judge Wright raised a curious eyebrow, but assented. Kane did not address the judge. Instead, he turned to the people of Redemption Bluff. "You have all judged me a murderer based on the color of my skin and the convenience of my presence," he began, his voice calm and steady. "But the man who killed Silas Croft does not wear chains. He wears a fine suit and sits among you believing his power makes him immune to justice." He raised a hand and pointed directly at Corbin Blackwood. A collective gasp rippled through the saloon. Corbin's lawyer leaped up, shouting objections, but the judge waved him down, his gaze fixed on Kane, his interest clearly captured. "You have no proof, you lying savage," Corbin sneered, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. "I have a witness," Kane stated. "I call Reverend Michael to the stand." The Reverend's walk to the front of the room was the bravest act of his life. He took the oath, and as he began to speak, the saloon became deathly quiet. He told the court of Silas Croft's terror, of the assay report of Corbin's threats, and of the gunshot he heard piercing the night. With every word, Corbin's confident smirk tightened into a rictus of fury. "Silas Croft was killed by a gunshot," Kane said, turning to the sheriff. "Yet I was found with a knife." "Did you find a gun?" Sheriff Brody miserably shook his head. "Because the killer took it with him," Kane concluded. But in his arrogance, he left other proof. He looked to Eleanor. "Mrs. Kane, please present the ledger." Her heart pounding, Eleanor walked forward and handed the heavy book to a marshal. She explained where she had found it, pointing out the damning page with the crude map, the initials SC, and the chilling note about a final offer. Judge Wright examined the page, his expression hardening. The pieces were connecting motive, a witness to a threat, a weapon discrepancy. The townspeople were no longer looking at Kane with fear, but at Corbin Blackwood with dawning horror. "These are lies. Fabrications." Corbin roared, his mask of civility finally shattering as he leaped to his feet. "This savage and his whore have conspired against me. She trespassed in my home to steal that book." "Sit down, Mr. Blackwood," Judge Wright commanded. But Corbin was beyond reason. His world was collapsing. In a flash of desperate fury, he drew a concealed derringer from his coat. He didn't aim it at Kane or the marshals. He aimed it directly at the man whose testimony had condemned him. "You have ruined me, you sniveling coward," he screamed at Reverend Michael. Panic erupted. Before the marshals could fully react to the sudden threat, Kane moved with a speed that seemed supernatural. He didn't charge. He kicked the heavy table in front of him, sending it plowing into Corbin's legs. Corbin stumbled, his shot going wide and splintering the wall. In that instant, Kane was on him. The sharp rattle of his chains was followed by the sickening crack of bone as he brought his cuffed hands down on Corbin's wrist. The derringer clattered to the floor. The fight was over. Marshals swarmed the howling, disarmed Corbin, pinning him to the dusty floorboards. Judge Wright's gavel slammed down, restoring order. "This trial is concluded," he boomed. "Corbin Blackwood, you are under arrest for the murder of Silas Croft and the attempted murder of a witness." He then turned his stern gaze to Kane. "As for you, the charges are dismissed. You are a free man." A marshal stepped forward with a key. With a single metallic click, the chains fell from Kane's wrists. The clang echoed in the stunned silence, a sound of final, absolute freedom. Across the room, Kane's eyes found Eleanor's. Their gazes locked. The bargain was complete. With Corbin Blackwood gone, Redemption Bluff exhaled. The cloud of fear that had choked the town lifted, replaced by an awkward reverence for the couple who had freed them. As a token of his penance, Sheriff Brody gave them the deed to a small abandoned homestead just outside of town. They moved from the jail to the cabin, trading iron bars for a shared roof, though they remained quiet strangers. Eleanor found a new purpose in making the cabin a home, while Cain rediscovered his freedom in the surrounding wilderness, a silent shadow who returned each dusk. Their bargain was complete, but they were still bound by law and circumstance. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the desert stars emerge, Cain broke the silence. "The bargain is complete," he said, his voice low. "You are free. You can take the next stage east." Eleanor considered it. The thought of returning to her old life in Boston, to its polite society and rigid expectations, felt like trading one cage for another. The unforgiving West had changed her, forged her into someone stronger, someone who no longer fit in that world. "I cannot go back," she replied softly. "That woman is gone." "And what would you do?" "I would stay," he said. "This land knows me." He looked at her, then a flicker of true understanding in his dark eyes. "Then we stay." It was not a question, but the start of a new pact, one made by choice. He pointed to the first star in the twilight sky. "My people call it the One Who Watches," he said, sharing a small piece of his hidden world for the very first time. Their future was not a promise of love, but something more real, a shared horizon for two survivors who had found in each other the most unlikely redemption of all. Thank you for joining us on this journey to the heart of the Old West. The story of Eleanor and Cain is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest courage is found in the most desperate of places, and the truest freedom lies just beyond the bars of our deepest fears. It reminds us that heroes and villains are rarely as they seem, and that a bargain made in the shadows can sometimes lead to the brightest dawn. If their story of defiance, survival, and unexpected partnership moved you, please help us share more tales like this. Hit that like button to let us know you were here. Share this video with a friend who loves a story of true grit, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the next chapter we have waiting for you.